After Estelle Getty passed away in 2008, her modest yet charming Mediterranean-style house in Hollywood Hills sat unoccupied for several years. Tucked on a quiet, narrow road off Laurel Canyon, the property was unassuming compared to the grand mansions nearby. It was a single-story home with warm stucco walls, clay roof tiles, and a courtyard shaded by mature jacaranda trees. By 2017, the house was quietly sold to a middle-aged couple from Chicago, Martin and Elaine Kessler. They were not Hollywood types. Martin was an orthopedic surgeon who had recently retired, and Elaine was an art historian with a fascination for old Hollywood. The couple sought a quiet life in California, away from Chicago winters, and were charmed by the idea of living in a home once owned by a beloved actress like Estelle Getty. They moved in during spring, when the air in the canyon was heavy with the scent of eucalyptus and damp earth. The house, though dated, was well maintained. Photographs of Estelle Getty, still left by the real estate agent as a quaint gesture, rested on built-in shelves. Elaine found these endearing and decided to keep them on display in the hallway. The first few months were uneventful, though Elaine remarked frequently on a strange scent in the hallway, a mix of lavender and old perfume. Attributing it to age and perhaps would rot, she dismissed it. But as summer deepened, oddities began surfacing. Every morning, precisely at 4:35 a.m., the small radio in the kitchen, which neither of them used, would switch on by itself. Always the same station, an oldies channel playing songs from the 1940s and 50s. Martin would grumble and unplug it, only to find it playing again the next morning plugged back into the wall. Elaine, more sensitive to the house's atmosphere, began to experience more direct encounters. She described to Martin a shadow that moved through the hallway, always just out of sight, always headed toward the small reading nook where Estelle was rumored to have spent her evenings with a book and a cup of tea. She also heard murmured conversations, barely audible whispers, as though an elderly woman was reciting lines or talking to herself in a low voice. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but the voices seemed to grow clearer when she was alone in the house, especially in the afternoons when the sun was beginning to set, casting long, orange shadows across the terracotta floors. One night, unable to sleep, Elaine wandered into the living room. She froze when she saw the television flicker on, the screen filling with static, then a sharp, grainy black and white image, old clips from the Golden Girls, but with distorted faces, as if the film reel was damaged. She turned it off, but the air grew icy, and she heard a dry, almost amused chuckle from the direction of the hallway. Martin, ever the skeptic, began to take notice when he saw the jacaranda tree by the courtyard sway violently on windless nights, and when picture frames, notably the ones with Estelle's photos, would crash to the floor for no reason. Determined to understand, Elaine contacted the previous caretaker of the property. The woman was reluctant to speak, but eventually confessed that Estelle had been deeply attached to her home. She spent her final years there, surrounded by her personal memorabilia, and would often speak aloud to herself as if she were still on stage, performing before an invisible audience. By late autumn, the disturbances intensified. Doors would close abruptly behind them, and the distinct scent of lavender would fill the air whenever either of them mentioned Estelle's name. The final, undeniable event came on a cool November evening. Elaine was alone, reading in the old reading nook, when she heard her name whispered. She looked up and, reflected faintly in the glass of the bookcase, saw a petite, elderly woman with short hair and large glasses smiling at her kindly but faintly sad. The figure mouthed something Elaine couldn't hear and then vanished. The couple never felt truly threatened, but a pervasive sadness filled the home. Elaine believed Estelle was lonely, still seeking company or perhaps unwilling to leave the place she loved most. They chose not to sell but instead brought in an archivist to restore the home with touches from Estelle's era, hoping to ease the spirit. To this day, visitors to the house still report the scent of lavender, the faint buzz of an old radio turning on at dawn, and the impression of soft footsteps moving through the hallways, almost like a performance that never quite ends. The house had a stillness to it that neither Martin nor Elaine could explain, even on bright days when the sun poured relentlessly through the high, wood-framed windows. It was a beautiful kind of silence at first, the kind that made them feel as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen, or for someone to speak. The terracotta tiles, worn slightly in the center of each hallway, suggested decades of gentle footsteps, but the house itself held onto sound too long. A closing door would echo faintly longer than it should. A dropped spoon in the kitchen seemed to send vibrations through the walls, as though the house was listening. Elaine started noticing the cold spots in late September, even though the Los Angeles heat was still heavy in the afternoons. There was one particular chair in the living room, angled just so toward the fireplace, that was always cool to the touch. She would lay her hand on the fabric after sun had streamed through the window for hours, and yet it felt as if it had been kept in a cellar. No matter how many times she sat there with a throw blanket over her shoulders, an undeniable chill settled into her skin, deep and numbing. At first, she rationalized it, but then came the dreams. Elaine's sleep, never troubled before, grew shallow, light, almost suspicious. She would wake up half a dozen times a night, never fully aware why. And when she did sleep deeply, her dreams were crowded. Crowded with faceless people seated in a living room that looked exactly like theirs but darker, older. The walls were stained with time, and the ceiling hung lower, suffocatingly low, as though trying to crush the people gathered inside. In the dream, they all sat in silence, turned toward the same corner where the old reading nook was, waiting for something or someone. She would try to speak, but no voice came out, and always, from that shadowed corner, there would come the faint outline of a small woman, petite, her shoulders hunched, her mouth moving soundlessly as though reciting lines from a play she no longer remembered fully. Elaine never told Martin about the dreams, thinking it would sound ridiculous, but her behavior changed. She avoided the reading nook altogether and began to resent evenings, when the house grew darker faster than it should. It wasn't just the fading daylight, it was as though the air itself grew heavier when night approached. The lights inside dimmed slightly, no matter how bright the bulbs were, as though the house permitted only a certain level of light after sundown. Martin remained practical, occupying himself with renovations. He hired a crew to repaint the walls, replace some of the aging wooden frames around the windows, and update the electrical wiring, though the electricians returned multiple times, confused by the way certain circuits seemed to reset themselves, particularly in the hallway where Estelle's photos were displayed. And then there was the hallway mirror. It was an old oval mirror, part of the house when they bought it, framed in heavy walnut with intricate carvings that reminded Elaine of theater dressing rooms. No matter how many times she cleaned it, there was always a faint cloudiness in the glass that seemed to swirl and move when the light hit it at the right angle. One afternoon, as she was dusting the frame, Elaine noticed something that made her step back abruptly. In the foggy lower corner of the mirror, an impression like a fingerprint but larger, more deliberate, had formed, slowly, as though someone was pressing from the other side of the glass. She watched, breathless, as it seemed to drag slowly down, leaving a faint trail before vanishing completely. She told herself it was a trick of the light, yet she refused to touch the mirror again. Weeks passed, and the sense of being watched intensified, especially when either of them was alone. They both began to speak aloud to the empty rooms, Martin in a half-joking, half-defensive tone, Elaine more tenderly, as though addressing a lonely child. "I know you're here," she whispered one evening while placing a fresh bouquet of lavender on the mantel. A strange compulsion she couldn't explain. "But you don't need to be lonely anymore." The response wasn't immediate, but later that night, as the house settled and cooled, the faint sound of a chair scraping slowly across the floor echoed from the living room. A single, purposeful sound. When Elaine checked in the morning, the chair by the fireplace, the cold chair, was angled slightly toward the hallway, as if someone had turned it just enough to watch the path that led past the reading nook. And the radio was on again. Always the same hour, 4:35 a.m. Always the same song. "I'll Be Seeing You," a war-era ballad, slow and wistful. Elaine didn't wake Martin this time. She sat in the kitchen alone, the radio low but clear, and listened to the lyrics. "I'll be seeing you, in all the old familiar places, that this heart of mine embraces, all day through." And for the first time, she felt the sadness inside the house as something nearly human. The echo of a life unwilling to be forgotten, rehearsing the past like a scene that never earned its applause. But there was something watching, not just with sadness, but with expectation. Elaine began to wonder if the performances Estelle gave in life hadn't truly ended. Only now, the audience was gone and the house was waiting for new players to take the stage. Martin remained unaware of the details Elaine was keeping to herself, but the house was starting to pull at his attention in quieter, subtler ways. He would sit reading medical journals in the study, a room they'd converted from what must have been Estelle's den, when the sensation would come over him. A gaze, not intrusive but insistent, like someone sitting just out of sight, expecting acknowledgement. At first, he tried to ignore it, immersing himself in words and diagrams, but his concentration broke every time. His eyes would dart toward the doorframe, expecting to see Elaine passing by. But no one was ever there. Sometimes he would stand abruptly and scan the hallway empty. Yet, there was always the impression of presence, like when you enter a theater after the crowd has gone but the air still feels dense with the weight of 100 conversations. One afternoon, while reorganizing the built-in shelves in the study, Martin found a thin, dust-coated box wedged deep behind some old hardcover books. The cardboard had grown soft and brittle with age. Inside, wrapped in fragile tissue paper, was a collection of playbills, handwritten notes, and a single, faded photograph of Estelle sitting in what looked like that very room, smiling wide, her eyes crinkling behind her signature glasses. She sat at a small table with a tea set, a script opened before her, and in the background was the very mirror now hanging in their hallway. But there was something else. A second photograph, worn nearly to nothing, captured the living room from a distance. On the back, in slanting, hurried handwriting, someone had written, "For the audience that never leaves." Martin turned the photo over repeatedly, puzzled, before calling Elaine into the room. She stared at the writing for a long time, the color draining from her face, and finally confessed everything. The dreams, the shadow in the reading nook, the mirror's ghostly fingerprints. She described the recurring scent of lavender and the way the radio seemed to summon itself to life every morning. For a long moment, Martin said nothing. Then he admitted that sometimes, when he passed the mirror late at night, he thought he saw the curve of a shoulder, the crown of a head, just out of frame, someone stepping out of view before he could focus. They sat in silence, surrounded by the relics of a life long gone, trying to make sense of it. That night, as the air cooled and the hills settled into their quiet nocturnal rhythms, they both woke up at the same time. The radio was on again, faint but unmistakable. But this time it wasn't just the music. It was laughter, soft, warm, familiar, the unmistakable cadence of a woman chuckling to herself, as if she just delivered a punchline and was waiting for the applause that never came. Elaine and Martin lay still, listening. The laughter carried gently through the air, accompanied by a faint shuffle, the sound of feet moving across tiles, and then the distinct sound of a chair scraping into position in the living room. Elaine reached for Martin's hand. "We have to see," she whispered, her voice trembling not just with fear but with a strange, almost reverent curiosity. They moved quietly through the darkened hallway, the walls absorbing their footsteps, until they reached the living room. There it was, the chair, again angled just slightly, but this time facing not the hallway, but the fireplace. The room was dim, but the faintest shimmer of movement flickered near the mantel, like heat rising from a candle flame, though no fire had been lit. The lavender scent was strong here, thick and layered with something older, like the dust of vintage velvet seats in an abandoned theater. Elaine spoke aloud, softly. "Estelle, is that you?" The shimmer seemed to pulse, just once, and then a voice not quite in the room, not quite in their heads, answered in a whisper so faint it was nearly consumed by the air. "Still rehearsing." Then silence. No footsteps, no laughter, but the air remained heavy, as though the house had breathed out but had yet to breathe back in. They stood frozen for minutes before retreating back to their bedroom, the air around them thick with something that wasn't just sadness, it was waiting. The next morning, the chair was back in its original position. The radio was silent, but on the mantel, next to the vase of lavender, was the faded photograph Martin had found the day before, the one of Estelle smiling in the study. Only now, there was a faint, new crease across the bottom corner, as if pressed by an unseen finger. And in that corner, written in an elegant but hurried hand, a sentence that hadn't been there before. "Don't forget your lines." Elaine and Martin stood together, reading those words over and over, neither daring to say what both were now thinking. The house was not just haunted. It was waiting for the curtain to rise again. They could no longer deny it. The house was alive with the residue of a life not fully gone, a presence stitched into every wall and floorboard. But Elaine, unlike Martin, began to feel a duty. She could not leave the house as it was, steeped in a sadness that grew heavier with each day. There was a dignity to the presence they shared their home with, something more than a mere haunting. She began her research in earnest. Every afternoon, she would sit in the study surrounded by old theater journals, scanned interviews, and biographies of Estelle Getty. She pieced together fragments of Estelle's final years, not just the public image of a beloved actress, but the private woman who had retreated into her home as her health declined, whose world had shrunk from the grandeur of stages and cameras to a few rooms and familiar books. Estelle had suffered not only physically, but mentally. Elaine discovered whispers in old fan forums, vague recollections of friends who'd visited her during her later years. They all said the same thing. Estelle was rehearsing until the end. Lines from plays, scripts from old shows, monologues she once perfected in front of live audiences. She spoke them to herself, to no one, or to someone she believed was still watching. Elaine's fascination grew. She began speaking to the house directly. She'd sit by the fireplace each night, reading aloud from scripts she found online, scenes from Torch Song Trilogy, passages of Blanche DuBois from A Streetcar Named Desire, roles Estelle had long admired but rarely played. And each night, as if in gratitude, the house seemed to breathe easier. The shadows that clung to the hallway lightened. The cold spots were less frequent. The radio no longer turned on at random, but only when Elaine was reading aloud, a faint crackle of static and music as if someone backstage was adjusting the sound. But Martin watched all of this with unease. The house was changing, yes, but so was Elaine. She was growing thinner, her eyes shadowed by dark circles, her sleep restless. She whispered in her sleep now, muttering lines he didn't recognize. Sometimes she would wake and claim she had dreamt of being on stage, blinded by spotlights, an audience waiting beyond the darkness, though she could never see their faces. One night, in early winter when the fog rolled in low and heavy through the canyon, Martin woke to find Elaine missing from their bed. The clock glowed 4:35 a.m., the same time the radio used to come alive. He found her in the living room, standing in the center of the floor where the carpet had worn thin. The cold chair was turned to face her, though he swore it had been against the wall when they went to sleep. Elaine was speaking softly but clearly, reciting lines from a play he didn't know. Her hands gestured slightly, as if performing for an invisible audience. Her voice, usually warm and soft, carried a sharper, rehearsed cadence now, a practiced rhythm. Martin stepped forward. "Elaine!" She didn't answer. Instead, a low murmur filled the room, not from Elaine, but from around her. The sound of seats shifting, bodies rustling, the anticipation of a crowd ready for the next act. Martin's heart pounded. He tried again, louder. "Elaine!" She stopped mid-sentence. Slowly, she turned her head to him, her eyes unfocused, as if she'd just stepped off a stage into the wrong world. "She's here," Elaine whispered. "She's watching." The air shifted. A presence swept through the room, weightless yet heavy, invisible but immediate. And then Martin heard it. The faint, unmistakable sound of applause. Distant, muffled, but real, hands clapping slowly, politely, as though an old audience was giving its final ovation. Martin grabbed Elaine's hand, pulling her back, but the sound faded just as suddenly. She blinked, her body slackening, and she looked at him, confused and pale. "I was just practicing," she murmured. They didn't speak of it that night. But the next day, Elaine insisted they remove the mirror from the hallway. She couldn't bear the sight of it anymore, claiming she saw her reflection moving even when she stood perfectly still. Martin agreed, and together they carried the heavy walnut frame out to the garage, covering it with a thick blanket. But the house remained different after that night. The laughter, the radio, the music, none of it returned. Only the weight of the empty audience remained. A waiting, an unfinished scene. Elaine withdrew from her readings. The scripts gathered dust again. But the sense of something watching never left. Even the walls seemed to lean closer in the evenings, as though straining to hear the next line that would never come. Months later, when Martin was alone in the house, Elaine having gone to visit family in Chicago, he sat in the study at dusk. The room grew darker faster than usual. He sat in his chair, the window beside him slightly cracked for air, when he heard it again. The applause. Soft, fading, as if from a distant room. And then a voice, unmistakable, a little dry but still warm, floating just at the edge of hearing. "Thank you, I'll be here all week." The air grew still. Martin rose slowly, staring down the hallway where the mirror had once hung, where the photos of Estelle still remained. He didn't move to investigate. He just stood there, listening to the quiet settle back into the bones of the house. Somewhere in the shadows, Estelle Getty was still rehearsing, still waiting for her audience. And the house? The house was just waiting for the next act. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.